The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard lived in the first half of the 19th century. One of his most wonderful sayings, which has fascinated me for years, is this: life can only be understood by looking backward, but it must be lived looking forward. Again, that's life can only be understood by looking backward, but it must be lived looking forward. Think about it. Think about your own life. When you went off to high school or college, or started your first full-time job, or began dating the person you would later come to marry, you had no idea what experiences lie ahead. What challenges, what successes, what disappointments, what failures were awaiting you. You had no idea what joys or sorrows would come into your life, short-term or permanently. You lived each day of your life moving forward, perhaps tentatively or with bravado, not knowing what the day would bring. And it was only in retrospect, when you took the long look back, that you could see how the landscape of your life had developed, how you were where you were because of all that had come before. How, as the poet Robert Frost said, the roads you had taken, quote, had made all the difference. You had lived your life forward, but you could only understand it by looking backward. Now, this saying of Kierkegaard applies not only to our own personal lives, but also to corporate lives, to institutions, to societies, to governments, to countries, and yes, even to the church. And since today we celebrate the Feast of Pentecost, which has long been called the birthday of the church, perhaps it's a good time to take a look back and see how the life of the church has developed. We won't go into a great deal about the 2,000-year history of the church, but I want to make just a few brief remarks about some of the dynamics the church has had and continues to have in its life. In the history of the church, there have been several times when the ground shifted and nothing was the same after that. Today we are celebrating the first of those events, Pentecost. The Pentecost account, which we heard in our first reading today, is from the second chapter of the book of the Acts of the Apostles. All indications in the New Testament are that this initial apostolic band saw themselves as faithful Jews who were following the promised Messiah. They attended the temple and continued to follow the Mosaic law. But now, after Jesus' ascension to the Father, all they can feel is grief and deep loss. They can see only danger in front of them. But then, suddenly is the word Luke uses. The Spirit grabs them and sends them out into the streets of Jerusalem, speaking in languages they neither know nor understand. Who could have expected such a thing? Like those first apostles, we too are now feeling the earth shift beneath our feet. The profound changes that the Roman Catholic Church has been experiencing during the past few decades are now accelerating in the past few years, and they range from obvious to subtle. The what's called de-Christianization of Europe has been evidenced by the growing number of empty churches throughout the continent. These European trends are now becoming more prominent in America. The largest single religious group in the United States still remains Roman Catholic. But do you know what the second largest self-identifying religious group consists of? Former Roman Catholics. The precipitous decline in priestly and religious vocations and the disappearances of parishes and institutions that their vast numbers had made possible, and the scandal of the pedophilia crisis and its mishandling by the hierarchy are symptoms of an institution that has been described as being in hospice care. Monsignor Tomáš Halík is a 73-year-old renowned Czech intellectual and former communist dissident who was clandestinely ordained to the priesthood in 1984 during the former Czechoslovakia's harsh communist dictatorship. He has written that more and more churches will be closed for good in the not-too-distant future, not because of outside forces like the recent pandemic we endured, but because of an unwillingness to reform. This Czech priest, who was in 2015 the recipient of the Templeton Prize for Science and Religion, suggests that churches that stood empty because of the coronavirus lockdown might symbolically show us what the future would be like if the church does not seriously try to present the world with a totally different form of Christianity. He writes this: "Have we not been warned enough by developments in many countries? Why do we keep blaming external factors like the tsunami of secularism instead of acknowledging that yet another chapter of the history of Christianity is coming to an end, and that it is thus necessary to prepare for the next chapter?" Halleck proposes that we use the present time to think far more deeply about church reform. He says that there cannot be a return to a world that no longer exists, or a mere modification of external structures. Rather, it must be a more profound reform, a reform which Pope Francis is always speaking about. Pope Francis describes the present moment in which we find ourselves as what he calls a, quote, propitious time to be open to the Spirit, who can inspire us with new imagination of what is possible. Indeed, the Pope says today, frontiers fall, walls crumble, and all the discourse of the fundamentalists dissolve in the face of an imperceptible presence which shows the fragility of which we are made. He says Easter calls us and invites us to remember this other discreet and respectful, generous and reconciling presence so as to start that new life which is given to us. This presence is the breath that the Holy Spirit brings, that opens horizons, sparks creativity, and renews familial bonds, and makes us say, "I am present," in the face of the enormous and urgent task that awaits us. The Pope recalls that the Spirit does not allow itself to, quote, be closed or manipulated by fixed or outmoded methods or decadent structures, but rather moves us to make things new. We might even describe what we're being called to as a new Pentecost. Two vehicles for implementing these changes, which the church is being called to, include, on the local level, our diocesan Road to Renewal program, and for the global church, the Worldwide Synod. Both of these vehicles outline processes for reform, but they do not arrive at a final structure. They leave that up to the Holy Spirit. As St. Paul promised, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, what God has ready for those who love God. The church, as it exists today, will be gone in a few generations or maybe a few decades or even a few years, but something new is already beginning. We don't see it yet. It's small and hidden. This is the turning point for the church. But we must not be pessimistic about the future. Everything is changing profoundly, but one thing will never change. We have the Holy Spirit given to the church at Pentecost, the Holy Spirit who will never, never abandon us. We are not left as orphans. God is always with us. And so we move ahead with confidence. We move ahead to the future with trust. Remembering our old friend Kierkegaard's advice, life can only be understood looking backward, but it must be lived looking forward.